Did you know that the Odyssey had a prequel about Achilles? The Iliad was another poem written by Homer back in the ancient Greek days. Scholars believe that both the Odyssey and the Iliad were meant to be told together as part of a big old performance. And while the Odyssey took place after the Trojan War, the Iliad takes place during the Trojan War, specifically nearing the end of it. We get some context clues as to how the Trojan War started sprinkled throughout the Iliad. According to legend, how it began was Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite were arguing and promised a golden apple to whoever was fairest. Now, the goddesses wanted to get a third party to decide, so they chose a shepherd boy, Paris, to be their judge. Each of the goddesses promised power, wisdom, and love, respectively. Paris decided he wanted the most beautiful woman of all, so of course, Aphrodite was picked, and she made Helen, Queen of Sparta, and the most beautiful woman of all, to fall in love with Paris of Troy. But see, here's the problem. Helen is married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. When Helen leaves Menelaus to go be with Paris, Menelaus declares war on Troy. So the Trojan War happened for 10 long years. So, like the Odyssey, the Iliad is split up into different books, which are more considered chapters. Now, this was harder to read than the Odyssey, unless you know everything that happens. With the Odyssey, it was a little easier to pick up what was going on. The Iliad is in the heat of battle, so most of the time you get things like Achilles killed this guy, and then he killed another one, and then Odysseus killed this guy, and then another one. There's even that whole part in the first 4 books where they list off the fighters in the Greek army and how great they were. And I mean, sure, for the time it makes sense for this, but nowadays, you can probably understand why most English teachers will cut out a good chunk of the Iliad and only have you guys read about Achilles and his shenanigans. But because I sat through the whole thing of my own free will, I will do very brief summaries of some of the not important things and delve a little deeper into the stuff your teachers might be looking for. But first, a little brief introduction on Achilles. Achilles is a demigod. His mother is the goddess Thetis. Thetis tried to make Achilles invulnerable by dipping him in the river Styx, but the heel that she held him by was not submerged. That makes it his weak spot. And that's where we get the term Achilles heel. So yeah, Achilles is very strong and very invincible except for one tiny weak spot. Alright, that's enough background. Let's get to the actual story itself. Like the Odyssey, the story begins in medias res. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, is the commander over the Greek armies. Now, a Trojan priest of Apollo by the name of Chryses is hoping to get Agamemnon to return his daughter, Chryseis, to him. Agamemnon refuses and Apollo sends out a plague. Now, Achilles isn't a big fan of this plague and calls everyone together to deal with the problem, and Agamemnon finally relents in giving Chryseis back to her father. But takes Achilles' captive Briseis, however you say the name, as compensation. Now, why did he do that? War prizes were tied to honor. And since Agamemnon is a freaking king, whereas Achilles is but a soldier, even though his mom is a goddess, Agamemnon felt it was only right that he should receive more honor. Achilles is not pleased that Agamemnon dishonored him, and decides to back out of the war. Meanwhile, Odysseus takes Chryseis back to her father, and the plagues stop. Achilles is still salty about being dishonored by Agamemnon, and asks his mom to tell Zeus to screw over the Greeks in the war since Achilles wants to show Agamemnon that they still need him. Zeus is fine with this. Zeus appears to Agamemnon in a dream and tells him not to attack Troy, and while Agamemnon heeds the dream, decides to test the army's morale by telling them to go home, but it seems the army's morale has worn thin after being out fighting for so long, and Odysseus is the one who manages to get everything under control before everyone leaves. The Greek and Trojan armies meet up to fight, but Paris steps in and offers to duel Menelaus for Helen's hand, and Helen will marry whoever wins. While considering Menelaus is a Spartan king, he wins easily, but Aphrodite swoops in at the last minute to save Paris and take him back home to Helen. Now right here, the gods debate on whether or not the war should go on. Hera insists that the war continue until Troy is utterly destroyed. So, Athena prompts an archer to shoot Menelaus. Don't worry, Menelaus is fine, but he is wounded and that sparks more fighting. Now, right here, a bunch more fighting goes on. The book literally goes over the details of who's fighting whom and who kills who. There's so much going on here that it's hard to keep track of. Although we do get an idea of how powerful Hector is. So, fast forwarding a bit, the Greeks are starting to get desperate. Agamemnon now realizes his mistake and sends Odysseus and some others with Briseis and many, many gifts to appease Achilles and get him back in battle. Well, Achilles is still salty about what happened, and says he won't attack unless the Trojans attack his ships. but that's unlikely since the Trojans know about Achilles and his power. The battle still rages on, but Achilles is curious about the battle and sends his best friend Patroclus to go check it out. Patroclus is told to go back and convince Achilles to come back to the battlefield, but if Achilles still refuses, Patroclus is to put on Achilles' armor and go into battle. With this strategy, hopefully the Trojans will mistake Patroclus for Achilles, and it'll scare them away. Now, Patroclus can't stand the sight of all this fighting going on and begs Achilles to let him go in his place in his armor. Achilles doesn't like this idea, but lets Patroclus go in his armor. He also tells Patroclus to come back immediately and not go after the Trojans. Well, Patroclus doesn't listen to Achilles' warning, and continues forward into the heat of battle as the Trojans run away. This is when Apollo steps in, and Hector ends up killing Patroclus and taking Achilles' armor. Achilles receives news of Patroclus' death and is very, very angry. He apparently shouts so loud that Thetis can hear him from the bottom of the ocean. Now, currently, the Greeks are trying to recover Patroclus' body so they can bury him, but the Trojans are trying to take it. Achilles immediately runs back into battle, slaughtering left and right, and helps the Greeks get Patroclus' body back to base. Since Achilles has no armor, Thetis has Hephaestus make Achilles new armor. Achilles goes back into battle feeling nothing. Even after all the gifts that Agamemnon gave back, Achilles only had one thing on his mind: to kill whoever murdered Patroclus. Achilles is now out on an even bigger killing spree, and it was so bad that he clogged up the nearby river with bodies. It got so bad that the river god Scamander told him to stop. But Achilles is still fueled by rage and actually fights Scamander and wins. Now, Apollo does not want the Trojans to lose, so he disguises himself and leads Achilles away from the city, but eventually Achilles sees through that deception and makes his way back to Troy. Now, Apollo actually gave the Trojans enough time to get into the city and barricade themselves, all except one, Hector. Achilles immediately rushes to kill Hector, and Hector tries to run away, but is tricked by Athena to stop and turn to face Achilles. Well, Hector is dead now, but as Hector is dying, he prophesies that Achilles will die at the hands of Paris. Now, Achilles doesn't really care. He dishonors Hector by taking his body, tying it to the back of his chariot, and drags it around the city. Now, the funeral rites for Patroclus are finished, and Achilles spends most of his days mourning Patroclus and dragging Hector's body around via chariot. Zeus at this point is pretty annoyed with Achilles mutilating Hector's body and decides that it should be returned to Priam, Hector's father. With guidance, Priam sneaks into the Greek camp with lots of gifts and begs Achilles for Hector's body. Achilles is moved and lets him take the body. Achilles isn't too happy about that, since he feels it's dishonoring Patroclus. The story ends with the Trojans mourning Hector. And now we all learn later in the Odyssey that Paris, with Apollo's help, shot Achilles in the heel and killed him. Now this is why you don't wear sandals to battle. Let's get to the analysis. Firstly, this is another epic. It has an introduction that starts with a plea to the muse to help the narrator tell the story, and the story begins in medias res. Now, while there aren't many flashbacks explaining what happened, there are a couple explaining how the Trojan War began. What's interesting is the prophecies that the dying people give. Patroclus tells Hector that he will die at Achilles' hand, and Hector tells Achilles that he will die at Paris' hand. This was also something seen in the Odyssey as well. I just find it interesting that these people somehow get the gift of prophecy as they lay dying. Alright, there is a lot of stuff about honor and glory in this story. The gods also play a major role in picking their warrior and helping them fight the battle. Actually, there was a portion where Zeus demanded that the gods stop intervening since it was getting everyone nowhere, but that ban was soon lifted when Patroclus is killed and Achilles goes out on his killing spree. Now here's one reason why the Iliad is harder to read than the Odyssey. The Odyssey covers adventures of one character throughout the entire plot, while occasionally going back to Penelope and Telemachus. The Iliad depicts many characters doing different things. I actually lost track of who was who very quickly while reading since there was so much going on. Now that's normal in a war setting where a lot is going on, but the only section that was easier to follow was Achilles' section. This is likely why English teachers will have you only look at this part of the Iliad and briefly sum up the rest. Honestly, while the epic may be well written and have a lot of stuff that really paints how the Greeks fought and shows a lot about their belief system and what they consider to be heroes, it is very hard to keep track of what's going on due to all the other people and who they kill. Seriously, they name all the people who are killed unless the person killed several people at once, like Achilles and Odysseus. All of that to me is very hard to keep track of, and I now appreciate the fact that English teachers only let us look at a little bit of the Iliad instead of the whole dang thing. I recommend this for ages 17 and up. It is very violent and pretty graphic, as is the nature of many stories about war. I'd still recommend giving it a read for historical purposes, but maybe focus more on the Achilles story rather than all the nitty-gritty details. While this book may have been a hard read, it was still interesting to look at again. I hope you guys will be able to get some enjoyment out of this and see the historical significance behind it. Happy reading!